At 9:29, I want to talk to Brian Synnott. Brian is a counselling therapist at Tig Lynn. Good morning, Brian. Nice to talk to you.
Good morning, Ryan. How are you keeping?
Really good, thank you. I don't know if you heard the emails and communications before the outbreak about what are we called dry drunks. And I know Tig Lynn, I know well the great work you and your friends and colleagues do there. This is not an expression that would be alien to you. Is there a dictionary definition, Brian?
Yes, it was a term that was created by the creators of the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step. And their definition is this: the presence of actions and attitudes that categorize the alcoholic prior to recovery. That's their definition in a 1970 book called The Dry Drunk Syndrome.
Right.
Very good read. So the actions and attitudes are still there. In fact, I would go further and say they're probably magnified. They're worse.
Yeah, flesh that out for me then. So this is somebody who's thinking of giving up the booze, and you're almost like cold turkey. Is that the sort of area we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, and it's how you look at addiction is very important. And how we need to look at addiction is that the problem isn't just stop the substance, whether it's alcohol or other illicit drugs. Stop the substance and you're fine. Addiction goes as far as physically, but it goes psychologically and even spiritually as well. It permeates, it affects the whole of the human being. And that's why good, thorough treatment is very, very important, not a superficial, just stop the booze.
What we're hearing is the horrible fallout. So if an alcoholic is in a house on their own, they can just damage themselves and the four walls that surround them. It's this awful side effects it has on humans that they live with that is so damaging. And the difficulty is, you'd want a heart of stone not to have some sympathy for the alcoholic also, because there's a reason for it too. But if they're a horrible alcoholic, the way some people can be almost a benign drunk, if you like. But if you're horrible, if you're vindictive, if you're cruel, if you're physically abusive, you're now living in the tyranny we've talked about before.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you're talking about this, Ryan, because it's a subject that's very close to my heart, because there are many families in Ireland that are living a nightmare because of exactly what you're talking about. And they have someone at home that is in early recovery or in what's called late recovery. They're 20 years off the substance, but they're living in hell. And there's a phrase we often use, and I'm sure your listeners will be aware of it: a street angel and a house devil.
Sure.
And I think we probably all know people like that. I mean, it is quite pervasive in our culture. And sure, there needs to be sympathy and support for the family. I would also argue there needs to be sympathy and support, but not enabling for the person who is off the substance. That actually, great that they're off the substance, but that's only step one. Many people in addiction have told me, hundreds in fact have told me, that getting off the substance is difficult, but that's the easy bit. Going from being sober to sober-minded is the real journey. To coming to a place of calm, coming to a place of rest within yourself, a place of wholeness. That's a completely different journey, really. So to say that someone is off the substance, well, that should be celebrated, but it's only step one. It's only putting the key into the ignition, if you understand what I mean. There's so many other things that need to happen for the journey of recovery to be possible. And or to be productive. Otherwise, everybody else around them is living in nightmare. And what can often happen is someone says, well, I'm off the substance now, or I've been to treatment, so now you owe me, and I am the moral authority in the house now because I've conquered this thing. And it can be just terrible to live with for everybody else.
Even the language you're using is so menacing. You owe me, I'm in charge, I give up the drink. Now this is what you wanted, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is. And what often happens, Ryan, is a fascinating but awful thing is that you can switch from one addiction to the other. So someone gives up, let's say, alcohol, but then they still have this craving psychologically and physiologically. And we forget, Ryan, that things like anger and rage release very powerful addictive substances inside in us.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That if an addict has an addiction to one thing, the anger can it's almost a replacement.
Yeah, it's a replacement substance, but you have
Right.
to do something to make it happen. So instead of picking up the bottle, well, you have to get angry, or a rage is often a part of this dry drunk syndrome, and a sense of inferiority, but it expresses itself in a superior form and in a superiority
So they release it by picking a fight with an innocent party,
with anybody.
with anybody, but they generally tend to do it by, from what I understand, at home, and then they go outside, and now the angel leaves the front door, and the devil is left
Yeah.
behind.
Yeah, because anyone who knows anything to do with addiction will know that shame is a huge issue for the person in addiction. So if shame is the huge issue, well, you can't hide at home very easily, but you can hide to your next door neighbours. You can hide to the extended family. And often the dry drunk is the star of the party, is the funny guy in the crowd, is the celebrity in some way, in a local dynamic or whatever else it is. And then when they come home, the children and the spouse, they're living a nightmare.
So
And it's a terrible conflict for the family, because they
Yeah.
see, well, everybody else thinks they're great, but wow, we must be wrong, you know?
Why doesn't the shame travel both ways? In other words, you're suggesting the person will feel ashamed as soon as they step outside the front door, outside the house. Why doesn't the shame follow them back inside, so that when they're horrible to somebody like a wife or a child, why can't they feel ashamed of being so horrible to those innocent people?
Well, familiarity breeds contempt, and you can't keep the front up at home.
Okay.
Everybody knows what we're like at home. We're different when we're at home. When we're out, we've social masks on, whatever they may be.
Yeah.
But we are who we are at home. We can't keep an act up at home. That doesn't work.
That's
Not for too long, anyway.
That's terrifying. And I tell you, it's even more terrifying because people can't leave their house now. So nature in all its cruelty has doubled down on that unpleasantness for people. And unpleasantness being too little a word for too big a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I reckon, Ryan, this is anecdotal, I don't have the figures to back this up, but I reckon that an awful lot of our domestic abuse has to do with this dry drunk syndrome. And the two aspects of it is there's one thing to be said for the guy or the lady who gives up the substance voluntarily, say, I'm deciding to give up whatever substance it is, whiskey or whatever. Mm-hmm. There's another thing, another ballgame altogether for someone who doesn't want to give up the substance but can't afford to buy it because they're unemployed. They're a complete nightmare to live with.
What happens to them?
Well, what happens to them is they become enraged.
Yeah.
Because people often don't understand addiction, that it's not just about putting down the bottle, but another word for addiction is dependency. It's a fabulous word to understand it, because when someone's in true addiction, they would prefer the substance than drawing oxygen. It's about survival. The body speaks to the mind and says, you are not going to survive unless you take whatever substance it is. And it's very, very real. That's the inside mind of someone who's in addiction. So to say just put down the bottle, that actually isn't the full answer at all. And I think it's the answer that many people give, that the drink is the problem. You mentioned that earlier on. The drink isn't the problem. The drink is the symptom. And it's the symptom of a whole load of emotional baggage.
Yes.
And the taking of the substance is medication. I mean, alcohol is old-fashioned medication. Illicit drugs that you get on the streets, it's medication.
Because is it the sense? Sorry to, but is it the sense that people with issues like this are on the run, and that's from demons?
Yeah. It's an escape. It's always an escape, because the pain is too much to face with. And that's why treatment is really important, and good treatment, because there's a lot of group work, there's a lot of acceptance and love and work on identity and all that kind of stuff, which is very, very important. Very thorough, but very possible. If there's anyone stuck in addiction today, it's very, very possible to get out of that, but you can't do it yourself. It's not possible to do it yourself.
That's a huge thing to say. You can't do it yourself. And I've seen what you guys do in Tiglin up close in my brief encounters with clients and people who work the system there, or work up in the system there with Aubrey and friends. And what struck me about it is that everyone who's had an addiction generally has a story, has a soul, and has a heart. And to me, watching it at that level, and my dad was a psychiatrist who dealt with a lot of people with addiction problems too, so maybe a bit of it rubbed off me in terms of curiosity on the subject, if nothing else, is that heart and that soul and that story is often reduced so much so that the person's lost sight of reality.
Yeah, that reality is too tough.
Yes.
Reality is too hard. And there's always a few common stories of trauma or rejection or pain or in emptiness, simple in emptiness. And there can be, a myriad of sources, but they all come down to the fact that the human mind or heart, whichever you want to call it, is aching. And unless that's, and if you take away the substance that's medicating that ache, well, that ache comes out at home. And that's a nightmare for everybody. That becomes an ache for everybody else then.
There is the other alcoholic who is a very kind and good person, but as soon as the first drop goes into them, they become monsters.
Yeah.
And the child or the person will be saying, wait, don't, please don't. And then they go, no, I want to, because, it'll be fine. And then, boom, you're into then that awful world until sobriety comes home.
Yeah. I mean, we've used the term as kids sometimes, Dutch courage. And often the quiet person is someone who is suppressed in some ways or locked in fear usually. But when the substance come in, all those defences go down. And I wouldn't say the real you, because it's a distorted you comes out, because then the medication, as I'll call it, but it's illicit. It's not prescribed. It's not balanced like your father would have done. Comes out in really distorted and very destructive ways for everybody.
Yeah, as you say, Brian, people can't do it on their own. And what makes me concerned about talking about these things on the radio is that we will say Al-Anon, Alcoholics Anonymous, alanon.ie, of course we'll say that, and we'll mention the other helplines and so forth that people go. But I get the sense a lot of people who are in these situations are so beaten down that the mere thought of trying to organise an intervention is too terrifying, or their hands are thrown up going, this is my lot, I'm out. I just have to face it, because the consequences of trying to put this injured person, the sick person, into the sin bin or whatever you want to call it, to dry out it's just too much. It's easy to say you should do this and you should do that and you should escape if it's becoming abusive, but it's never easy.
No, life is really complicated, and there's a thing of codependency that we don't have time to get into today. But also, there's sometimes just financial dependency. I can't leave with the children because I can't eat. I have nowhere to live. Yeah. But what you can do, Ryan, is take the first step, and the first step is to make relationships outside that zone, friends. Whatever about professionals, friends who are outside of that understanding, friends often who don't know anything about addiction, because they'll turn to you and to say, this is wacko, we need to get you out of here, we need to form a plan. And sometimes that's a long-term plan. Yeah. I know someone that formed a plan for 8 years,
really
lived in an abusive, dry drunk relationship, and for 8 years they had a plan to get out of the situation. Now, they didn't have children, but that's how complex it can be.
And did they get out?
But they did.
Successfully.
In fact, I was talking to her yesterday on the phone.
And how is she?
She's great. Absolutely great. But needed to put a whole load of distance. And it takes a long time as well to disentangle the lies and the deceit. One of the core issues with addiction, Ryan, as you'll know, is deception. Self-deception for the addict, but actually deceptive on everybody else as well. It's like living in your own little cult, a family cult.
Yeah. That's a really good way of putting it, because with every cult, there's a cult leader, and who firmly believes in what he or she is saying is the law.
Yeah, and there's a dependency on the cult leader.
And there is a dependency on the cult leader, because then you realise, or you think, I suppose, I don't think I could function in normal society if he or she wasn't there.
That's right.
And now you're terrified into paralysis.
Yeah, but what I'll say, Ryan, is we live, and as much as we complain about our governments and all that kind of stuff, we live in one of the richest countries in the world. There is help. There is support. And if I could just throw in Tiglin's number there for a minute.
Please do, yeah.
0404 400 10, and also 085 158 2112, Jessica in Pierce Street. If you're in trouble and you don't know how to get out, if you need treatment or whatever, those numbers will be a signpost for you to take the next step. And you can have a confidential conversation there and at least get the ball rolling. All you need to do is start taking the first step. You don't have to get to step number 1 or number 10. You only have to get to step number 1. the next step, and you can do the next step. Without doubt, you can do the next step.
Okay, that's very reassuring, and people should know that with regard to the numbers you give out, very people to remember or write them down, is that we'll put them on our Facebook page with a link to what you guys do, and I think that'll be very helpful. If you're just joining us, Brian Synnott is a counselling therapist at Tiglin, which helps people to recover from addiction. Brian, a few questions from you on the text, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
My experience as a text is that even when my alcoholic father dried up, we all had to still dance around him, dance around his recovery, his road, his challenges. Meanwhile, a family of 7 navigated their young lives and are all now in therapy. This shatters families.
That's right, absolutely, and that's where the person who's the addict or the alcoholic needs to be informed at some stage. It's not all about you. It's also about us. We do love you. That's important, that we don't treat someone in addiction as something awful or subhuman or something, although they're behaving like that. Mm-hmm. But we can say, we do love you, but we also love ourselves, and we can't tolerate this anymore. We won't tolerate this anymore. Very, very important. Now, how you do that, you need wisdom to do that. But if you find yourself in a family where you're dancing around one figure all the time, it's an abusive. Whether it's dry drunk, whether it's addiction, it's abusive, and it's harming everyone else, particularly the children. I remember I'm a therapist, so I talk about people's pasts all the time, and it always goes back to those formative years, and if we could prevent even just one family this morning from entering into that, wouldn't that be fabulous?
Yeah. Oh, you speak wise words, there's no doubt about it. What your guest is saying is really hitting home, says another text. My father is a raging alcoholic and was an absolute tyrant in the house. It took me so long to cut him out of my life, and I know that I still get funny looks when I try to explain myself and what he was like. I can tell that nearly most people don't believe how bad it got because he's so good at playing people.
Yeah.
This is the house devil rather, street angel you talked about. I'll do a couple more and you can have a reflection in a moment. My mother was, as you described, says the text, kind when sober, but she was abused as a child and an alcoholic all of her adult life. My lasting memory is, as a child, she'd give me her bottles to dump in a field down the road, and I can still feel the shame as a 6-year-old who knew that this was wrong, but who loved their mother. She died aged 60, and it was almost a guilty relief. Another says, I've lived with a woman for 26 years. Good times are great, bad times are torture. She brought her own issues into the marriage that took years to come to the surface. I stayed because I love my family and my 2 kids. My kids now cannot wait to move out. My wife is the best in the world, but just don't put a drink in her hand. I'm at my wit's end. Just as recently as last night, my son and I had to block the driveway to the house to stop her driving drunk and getting more drink. I fear we can't do anything about it if she won't help herself. Just to say, a woman is just as domineering and cruel as any man. I love my wife and I've cried and stressed over her, but it won't change. This is a tiny insight, Brian, a tiny, tiny straw poll into what's happening in houses around this troubled country. And I mean troubled, obviously, for COVID and mental health. And I know you were saying, and we've been talking about this mental health tsunami, booze or no booze. We talked about it yesterday, that when the shutters are up, there's going to be a lot of damaged people coming out from houses and flats around the country. There is going to be a premium on minding.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And what we need to break, because of our historical reasons here, Ryan, is the shame. This is our secret. This is our family secret. Don't let anybody know. The next door neighbours are not meant to know.
Is that Irish? Or, I mean, would they do this in Scandinavia or Germany? Do they say, you've got a drunk problem, you are drunk and we love you, but get fixed and come back? Or do we have an Irish sense of shame and secrecy that's
I've
different?
I've worked in the UK an awful lot, and they don't have it to the same extent at all.
And in America, they'll tell you if in a queue for a coffee.
Yeah, no problem. There are shame-based cultures, and I would argue that ours historically is a shame-based culture.
Amazing, isn't it? It's desperate. Yeah, I'd love to get out of that.
Dreadful. Yeah. Well, how we get out of that is start sharing with one another and stop being paranoid about what people think. People aren't actually thinking about you all the time.
It's so true. It is so true. And actually, I know that I was talking to somebody recently, and they were going through the horrors, and I said, it's not as bad as you think it is. You think that everyone's... It's a bit like, and I'm being really silly, but it's a bit like when you have maybe a spot, a zit, or something on your face. You think it's the size of Mount Rushmore, where it's actually... And no one else notices it. But you're walking around going, sorry about it, pointing at saying sorry, like that Irish. But actually, you're grand. So it is... It's just kind of silly thing to be saying, but you do know what I mean. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, but you're not that important to everybody.
That's exactly it. And yet you are at that most important level that we're talking about, which is local level, which is home.
Absolutely.
Okay, enjoying your discussion about alcoholism. My husband struggled with alcoholism, but my friends really crippled me with judgments. They told me I was stupid for staying. They stopped speaking to me. They punished me for staying. It made a bad situation even worse. Crikey, that's not great.
No, and we'd need to go into the details on that.
Of course. Could you ask Brian about the significance of personality disorder hitherto masked by self-medicating behaviour such as alcoholism, drug addiction, gambling addiction, etc.? I presume is this something you come across in your?
Oh yeah, and this is actually where Tiglin is championing at the moment in a thing called dual diagnosis. Putting the horse before the cart. Which is it? Is it a personality problem, a disorder, or whatever, or is it addiction, or is it both? And Tiglin, as far as I'm aware, are leading that in the country. Certainly they're very prominent within that because it often is the problem. And then when you approach the health services, be it private or public, often it's like, they'll move from one department to another. Yeah. So where does it fall down? So, but what I would say is, again, you have to break things down very simply. And all you got to do is start wherever you are, whether you're the dry drunk or the victim of that. You just need to make the first step. And when you get to the first step, you'll probably figure out what the second step is. But take that first step. Very important.
It's such good advice, Brian. I've enjoyed, if that's the right word, talking to you this morning. But it's refreshing, it's concise, it's clear advice, and it's a healthy conversation. Like you say, the only reason we're going to become a less shame-based society is by talking about stuff. Tiglin, TIGLIN.ie, all details there. Brian, it's been great to talk to you. Look forward to seeing you at one of the centres at some point when the fates allow.
Great. Missed you last time with the barbecue. Thank you.
Exactly. Get there again. All right, Brian. Nice talking to you.
God bless you. Thank you.
That's Brian Synnott, who's counselling therapist at Tiglin. And like he alluded to there, sometimes they have a barbecue in the summertime as they come up and visit all the clients who stay there. And it gives you great insight into the world and a very painful world for a lot of people, but even more importantly, a very hopeful world because there is that hand of friendship out there for you if only you could have the courage to take it. And if you are going to take that first step, as Brian says, we wish you every success. Good luck.